Good to see you in a new video on Betrayal Wife Tales. Today I'm going to tell you an interesting story of our subscriber.
I used to think I had it all. My name is Daniel, and I've been married to Sarah for 5 years. At 32, I thought my life was set, a great job, a beautiful wife, and a nice home in the suburbs. We were the couple everyone envied. Sarah was the stunning, fiery redhead, with a body that made heads turn and a smile that could melt any heart. She worked in marketing, and her career was skyrocketing. We met at a work event. Yeah, a classic story. She was the center of attention, everyone hanging on her every word. But it was me she chose. We dated for 2 years before tying the knot, and for a while things were perfect, or so I thought. See, Sarah has always been ambitious. She thrived on challenges, never satisfied with anything less than being at the top. At first, I admired that about her. She took no prisoners, and her confidence was intoxicating. But somewhere along the line, that drive started to overshadow everything else. The late nights at the office became more frequent, and when I'd ask, she'd snap, telling me how much pressure she was under, how hard it was to be a woman in a male-dominated industry. I believed her because I loved her, and I wanted to support her. But then, there was her boss, Michael. He was always in the picture, tall, smooth-talking, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in a high-end fashion magazine instead of running a company. I didn't think much of him at first. He was married, had kids, and seemed professional. But Sarah talked about him all the time. "Oh, Michael had this great idea today." Or, "Michael's pushing for me to lead this project." You get the idea. I told myself it was harmless, that she was just excited about her work. I trusted her. God, I trusted her. But now, looking back, I can see how blind I was. The first real sign something was off came about 3 months ago. Sarah started coming home later and later. It was always work-related, meetings, deadlines, you name it. I asked her if everything was okay, but she'd blow up at me, accusing me of being clingy and paranoid. I didn't push. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who suffocates his wife with insecurity. So, I let it slide. I let a lot of things slide, until that one night, the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, and Sarah was supposed to be home early so we could have a date night. I'd planned the whole thing, fancy restaurant reservations, her favorite wine, the works. But 7 p.m. came, and she wasn't home. I texted her, no response. By 8:30, I was getting worried. She finally texted back around 9, saying she had to stay late for a last-minute meeting with Michael. My heart sank. Still, I convinced myself I was overreacting. It's just work, right? When she finally walked through the door after midnight, she was different. I don't know how to explain it. Her energy, the way she looked at me, it was like I wasn't even there. She mumbled some excuse about being exhausted and went straight to bed. I stood in the living room for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the sinking feeling in my gut. That's when I knew something was wrong. After that night, things spiraled fast. Sarah's distance became more obvious, and our marriage felt like it was hanging by a thread. Every little thing between us turned into an argument, whether it was the way I folded the laundry or how I asked her about her day. It was like walking on eggshells around her. And then there were the late-night work meetings with Michael that started happening almost every week. I tried not to let it get to me, but it was like watching someone slowly drift away, and you're helpless to stop it. Sarah became a different person, more guarded, more secretive. Her phone was always glued to her hand, and when I asked who she was texting, she'd roll her eyes and snap, "It's work, Daniel. You wouldn't understand." The turning point came when she left her laptop open one night. It was around 2 a.m., and she'd passed out on the couch, probably after another one of her late nights. The laptop screen was still on, and I wasn't even planning to snoop. But then I saw it, a message notification from Michael. I shouldn't have clicked on it, but I couldn't help myself. It was right there. And what I saw, it shattered everything. It wasn't work-related, far from it. The messages were flirty, playful, and dripping with innuendo. But the worst part was one she sent earlier that night. "Tonight was incredible. You always know how to make me feel alive." My heart stopped. My stomach twisted into knots. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, my world collapsing right there in the middle of our living room. I read further, each message stabbing deeper. They'd been seeing each other for months, sneaking around behind my back while I was here like an idiot, planning romantic dinners and trying to fix a marriage that was already broken. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, trying to process it. Was this really happening? I had suspected something was off, but to see it in black and white, it was a whole different level of pain. My mind raced, alternating between anger, betrayal, and sheer disbelief. How could she do this to me? I didn't wake her up. I didn't scream or throw things like every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I closed the laptop, quietly went to bed, and stared at the ceiling until the sun started creeping in through the blinds. The next day, I confronted her. I waited until after breakfast, trying to hold it together, but I couldn't keep it in any longer. "Are you cheating on me?" I asked, my voice trembling, not with anger, but with raw hurt. Her reaction was instant, defensive, like she'd been preparing for this moment. "What are you talking about, Daniel? You're being ridiculous," she spat, crossing her arms, her face twisted in irritation. "I saw the messages, Sarah," I said, trying to stay calm, but my voice cracked. "Between you and Michael." Her eyes went wide for a second, just a second, and then her whole expression shifted. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. In fact, it was like a mask had fallen off her face, and the real Sarah, the one who had been hiding for months, finally came out. "Oh, for God's sake, Daniel," she snapped, her voice sharp, cutting through me like a blade. "You're always so paranoid. It's nothing. He's my boss, and we're close, sure, but don't turn this into something it's not." But I could see it. I could hear it in her voice. The lie, the way she deflected, the way she avoided my eyes. She was guilty, and we both knew it. I didn't back down this time. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw it all. Just be honest with me." And that's when she exploded. She launched into a full-blown tirade, accusing me of being controlling, insecure, and not giving her the space she needed to breathe. "You're smothering me," she yelled, her face red with anger. "Maybe if you spent less time obsessing over my life and more time focusing on your own, we wouldn't be in this mess." Her words hit me like a freight train. I stood there speechless as she unleashed months of pent-up frustration. She didn't apologize. She didn't even try to explain herself. Instead, she flipped the entire situation on me, like it was my fault she had to seek comfort elsewhere. By the end of her rant, she stormed out of the house, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left nothing but the shell of the man I used to be. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some fling for her. This was something deeper, something she didn't regret. And I realized with gut-wrenching clarity that the woman I loved, the woman I had built my life with, was no longer mine. After Sarah stormed out that day, something inside me broke. I tried to go through the motions of life, but everything felt off, empty. I kept replaying her words in my head, her coldness, the way she made it seem like this was all my fault. I wasn't perfect, sure, but I didn't deserve this. Not the lies, not the cheating. Days passed, and she didn't even try to talk to me. No apologies, no attempt to explain. She acted like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just blown up our entire marriage in one night. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was tense. Clipped conversations about household chores or bills. Every time I looked at her, all I saw was the betrayal, the messages, and that smug confidence she had when I confronted her. It wasn't long before the late nights started again. She'd come home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, with excuses that were so paper thin it was insulting. "Oh, we had a work dinner," she'd say, casually dropping Michael's name like it was normal, like I hadn't caught her in the act. "It's part of the job, Daniel. You wouldn't get it." I didn't fight it anymore. I knew what she was doing, where she was really spending her time. The trust, gone. The love, fading with every lie she told. I felt myself pulling away, emotionally checking out because it hurt too much to stay invested in someone who didn't give a damn about me. But there was still a part of me, the stupid, desperate part, that wanted to believe it could be saved, that maybe, just maybe, she'd come to her senses and realize what she was throwing away. I suggested counseling one night, trying to keep my voice steady as I threw out the last lifeline I had. She laughed. Not a little chuckle, not a nervous giggle, but a full-on laugh. Like I had just said the most ridiculous thing in the world. "You want counseling? Daniel, seriously?" She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "We don't need therapy. You need to stop being so insecure. This is your problem, not ours." That was it. That was the moment I knew for sure. There was no coming back from this. She didn't care about fixing things, didn't care about me. And suddenly, I didn't care either. The hurt had turned into anger, the sadness into something darker. I started digging, looking for proof. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe to protect myself, maybe to confirm what I already knew. Late one night, when Sarah was out again, I went through her phone. I knew her passcode, she hadn't bothered to change it. And there, in the messages, was the truth staring me right in the face. Her conversations with Michael weren't just flirty anymore. They were explicit. They talked about their meetings in detail, recounting what they did behind closed doors. My stomach turned as I read them. I felt sick, but I couldn't stop scrolling. There were pictures, too. Intimate ones, the kind that made my blood boil. But it wasn't just about sex. There were messages where they laughed about me, calling me clueless, making fun of how oblivious I was. Michael even joked about how easy it was to manipulate Sarah into coming over. And the worst part? She laughed along, like it was all a game. I slammed the phone down on the table, my hands shaking with rage. I couldn't take it anymore. I wasn't going to sit by and let her disrespect me like this. Let her walk all over me while playing house with her boss. The next day, I made a decision. I needed to confront them both. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. If this was the end of my marriage, then I was going to end it on my terms, not theirs. It didn't take long to find out where they'd be. Sarah was too predictable. She had mentioned another late meeting at the office that night. But I knew better. I knew exactly where they'd go. That night, I followed her. I waited until she left, her usual, "I'll be home late" text already sent to my phone. I trailed her car, my heart pounding as I watched her drive, not to the office, but to a hotel on the edge of town. Of course, that's where they were meeting. I parked a little ways away, waiting until she went inside before following. My hands were shaking as I walked through the lobby, heading for the elevators. I didn't care who saw me. I had one goal, one burning purpose in my mind: to catch them, to finally put an end to this nightmare. I found their room easily enough. Room 417. I could hear them inside, laughing, the muffled sounds of their voices making my blood boil. My fists clenched as I stood outside the door, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. I raised my hand to knock, ready to confront them both in the most epic way possible. Standing outside that hotel room, my heart was racing, my body trembling with the weight of what was about to happen. It was all coming to a head. Months of suspicion, heartbreak, and betrayal boiling over into this one moment. I could hear them inside, laughing, totally oblivious to the storm about to crash down on them. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rage coursing through my veins. My hand hovered over the door, ready to knock, but something in me snapped. I didn't want to knock. I didn't want to give them a chance to hide, to lie their way out of this. I wanted them caught, raw and exposed, with no escape. So, I kicked the door. The sound echoed down the hallway as the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shocked even me. Inside, there they were, Sarah and Michael, tangled together in bed, half naked and frozen in place, their faces twisted in a mix of shock and terror. It was like time stopped, everything slowing down as the reality of what I had just done sank in. For a second, none of us moved. Sarah's mouth dropped open, her eyes wide with disbelief. Michael, still in bed beside her, looked like he had seen a ghost. I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he scrambled to cover himself with the blanket, but he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence broke when Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaky and filled with that same bitchy arrogance she always used when she was backed into a corner. "Daniel, what the hell are you doing here?" she snapped, pulling the sheet up to cover herself, as if she still had the right to act outraged. "You're insane. You can't just break in here like this. I felt a surge of anger, more intense than anything I'd ever felt in my life. My entire body was shaking with it. The betrayal, the lies, the months of being made to feel like I was the one losing my mind. And here she was, acting like I was the problem, acting like she was the victim. I can't believe this is real, I growled, my voice low but shaking with fury. You think I'm the one who's insane? You've been screwing your boss behind my back for months, Sarah. In our marriage? And you have the nerve to stand there and act like I'm the bad guy? Her eyes darted toward Michael, who was still silent, looking as pathetic as ever. She hesitated for a second as if deciding whether to fight or give in, and then her whole demeanor shifted. The mask dropped, and suddenly, she didn't bother pretending anymore. The anger, the deflection, all of it melted away, replaced by something much colder, much darker. You know what? She spat, her voice dripping with venom. Yeah, I have been. Because unlike you, Michael actually gives a damn about me. He listens. He makes me feel alive, Daniel. Something you haven't done in a long time. Her words cut deeper than I could have imagined. I could feel my heart breaking all over again. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't sadness or disbelief. It was pure, white-hot rage. So, that's it? I asked, my voice shaking. That's your excuse for blowing up our marriage? Because I wasn't good enough? Because he makes you feel alive? You're such a selfish, heartless... Stop it, she interrupted, her voice rising. I'm not going to let you guilt-trip me, Daniel. This was never going to work. I've known that for months. You're not enough. You've never been enough. I stood there staring at her, my mind reeling. How could she say that? After everything we had been through, after everything I had done for her, the sacrifices, the love, the loyalty, and all of it, all of me, was just not enough. But the most gut-wrenching part? She didn't look sorry. She didn't even look guilty anymore. She looked relieved, like she had been waiting for this, like she wanted me to walk in and catch her, to finally put an end to the charade. You're a monster, I whispered, my voice cracking. But I didn't feel weak anymore. I felt stronger, the kind of strength that comes from knowing you've hit rock bottom, and there's nowhere to go but up. Michael, the coward that he was, finally spoke, his voice shaking as he tried to salvage whatever dignity he had left. Look, man, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't want to hurt you. I laughed. I actually laughed, because the sheer audacity of it all was just too much to process. You didn't mean to hurt me? I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. You've been sleeping with my wife, laughing about me behind my back, and you want to pretend like this wasn't intentional? Are you really that much of a piece of shit? He didn't respond. He just sat there, looking helpless. And I realized in that moment that he wasn't worth my anger. He wasn't worth anything. Neither of them were. I stepped back, my fists still clenched at my sides, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. You know what, Sarah? You deserve each other. You and this pathetic excuse of a man. With that, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The weight of it all hit me as soon as I stepped into the hallway. My marriage, my life, everything I thought I knew, gone. But as I walked away from that hotel room, something strange happened. I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt free. Walking out of that hotel felt like breaking free from chains I didn't even know I was wearing. The weight of the betrayal was still there, pressing on my chest, but there was something liberating about finally confronting the ugly truth. I had faced Sarah and Michael head on, and even though my world had just collapsed, I no longer felt like the helpless, clueless husband stuck in the dark. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But my mind was strangely clear. I knew what I had to do next. I wasn't going to wallow in pity, begging for answers or closure. I had already gotten my answer, and it was loud and clear. Sarah had chosen someone else, and she wasn't coming back from that. Neither was I. When I got home, the house felt empty, cold. It wasn't just the physical space, but the memories that filled it, the life we had built together. Now nothing more than ghosts of what once was. I could still see her shoes by the door, her perfume on the counter. The place was filled with her, but I knew that version of her, the one I had loved, the one I had married, was gone, and she wasn't coming back. I sat down on the couch, staring at the empty space where we used to laugh, where we used to make plans for the future. It felt surreal, knowing that all of that had been a lie. But I wasn't going to let it destroy me. I couldn't. Not after everything I had been through that night. I grabbed my phone and started typing out a message. It wasn't angry, it wasn't emotional, it was just final. I'm done. Don't come back. I hit send. That was it. No long explanations, no begging for forgiveness. I had nothing left to say to her. She made her choice, and I was making mine. I was cutting her out of my life once and for all. The next morning, Sarah came back to the house, of course. I wasn't surprised. She probably thought she could talk her way out of this, spin it so that somehow I was still to blame. But when she walked through the door, she was met with the sight of her bags, packed and waiting for her by the front entrance. Her face fell, and for the first time, I saw something close to regret flicker across her eyes. But I wasn't falling for it. "Daniel, please, we need to talk," she started, her voice softer now, as if she was trying to play the role of the apologetic wife. I shook my head. "There's nothing left to say, Sarah. I saw everything. I know everything. You made your choice. Now, live with it." She tried to argue, tried to justify herself, but I wasn't listening. I couldn't. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the same woman I had fallen in love with. She was a stranger, someone who had hurt me in ways I never thought possible. And I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "This is over." That hit her. I could see it in the way her face paled, the way her confidence faltered. "You don't mean that," she whispered, taking a step toward me. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling. Try again." "It was a mistake, Daniel. Please don't do this." But her words were empty, and I knew it. I had seen the truth in those messages, in the way she had laughed at me with Michael, like I was nothing more than a fool to her. I couldn't unsee that. I couldn't unhear the things she had said. "No, Sarah," I said, meeting her eyes with a coldness I didn't know I had in me. "The mistake was trusting you. The mistake was thinking you were someone worth fighting for. But I'm done fighting. Get your things and go." She started to cry then, the tears streaming down her face, but they didn't move me. I felt nothing for her anymore. She wasn't crying because she was sorry. She was crying because she had been caught, because the life she had taken for granted was crumbling beneath her. When she realized I wasn't going to budge, she finally grabbed her bags and left, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house, but I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt calm. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I was in control of my life again. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild. I met with a lawyer, filed for divorce, and cut off all contact with Sarah. She tried reaching out a few times, sending me messages about how she missed me, how she wanted to talk, but I never responded. I wasn't interested in her half-hearted apologies. She had destroyed everything we had, and there was no coming back from that. The day the divorce was finalized, I stood outside the courthouse, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, sadness, freedom. It was over. Everything with Sarah, the marriage, the lies, it was all officially behind me. And as painful as it had been, I knew I was stronger for it. Life moved on. I moved on. It wasn't easy at first, but with every passing day, I started to feel like myself again. The guy I had lost in that toxic marriage slowly began to emerge, piece by piece. And though the scars were still there, I wore them as reminders of what I had survived. As for Sarah and Michael, I heard through the grapevine that their little affair didn't last long. Michael's wife found out, of course, and he ended up losing his job in the fallout. The last I heard, Sarah had moved out of town, trying to start over somewhere new. But none of that mattered to me anymore. They were both just chapters in a story I had closed for good. And as I stood there, looking out at the world with a fresh perspective, I realized something important. I hadn't lost. I had escaped. And for the first time in a long time, I was free to start again.
I never thought my life would take such a sharp turn. I remember a time when everything felt stable, unshakable even. My wife Laura and I had been together for almost 12 years. We had our ups and downs, sure, but every couple does, right? Or so I thought. It was last fall when I started noticing subtle changes. At first, it was easy to dismiss. She'd been staying late at work more often, which I figured was just the usual year-end rush. She's a project manager at an advertising agency, and every year she's swamped with client deadlines around that time. I didn't question it, not until things started piling up in ways that didn't add up. We'd always been close, talking about our days over dinner, sharing little details, but she became guarded. She'd leave her phone face down, silencing notifications with an awkward chuckle, saying it was just work stuff. Then there was the distance, not just physically, but in every sense. Even when we were together, she felt miles away. She stopped laughing at my jokes, became less interested in the plans I'd suggest, and always had some excuse to keep us from spending quality time together. It felt like I was losing her, piece by piece. One evening, I decided to surprise her at work, hoping maybe she just needed a reminder that I was still here, still in love with her. But when I arrived, her coworkers told me she had left hours ago. They looked confused when I mentioned she'd been working late. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I drove around aimlessly, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to ask her, to confront her, but how could I? If I was wrong, I'd sound paranoid, insecure, but if I was right, I wasn't ready for what that might mean. For the next few weeks, I watched her. I know it sounds obsessive, but I felt like I had no choice. There were too many small, unsettling details I couldn't ignore. She'd come home later, sometimes with the faintest trace of cologne that wasn't mine. When I'd ask about her day, she'd be vague, saying she'd been meeting clients or handling agency issues. But her eyes, something was missing. Finally, on a chilly Friday night, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through her phone. She'd left it unlocked on the counter, and before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself scrolling through her messages, my heart pounding in my chest. What I found wasn't explicit, but it was enough. There were messages from someone named Jay. Conversations filled with inside jokes, plans for lunches, even a few late-night chats where she'd talk about feeling free and excited. I could hardly breathe. The messages haunted me for days. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It felt like my mind was stuck on repeat, going over every word, every emoji, every little hint that Laura had been pulling away from me while leaning closer to someone else. I didn't know who Jay was or how long this had been going on, but I knew I had to find out. On Monday, I couldn't focus at work. I was just going through the motions, counting down the minutes until I could go home and see her, maybe even get the nerve to confront her. But when I got home, she wasn't there. Laura had left a quick note on the counter, something about a work dinner with the new clients her agency had taken on. It was vague, like so many of her excuses had been lately. Instead of waiting, I decided to find out for myself what was really going on. I knew where her office was hosting the dinner, a small, high-end restaurant downtown that she'd mentioned a few times before. I figured if I could see her there, maybe catch her alone, I might get the chance to talk to her. Or maybe I'd see something that could give me answers without needing to ask. When I arrived at the restaurant, I parked across the street, hidden by a row of trees. My heart raced as I scanned the windows, looking for her. About 20 minutes later, I saw her walk in, but she wasn't alone. She was with him. There he was. Jay, I assumed. Tall, dark hair, wearing a well-fitted suit. He had that kind of confidence that made him seem larger than life, the kind that radiated and made everyone else fade into the background. Laura looked different with him. She was laughing, her eyes bright. Her face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. They didn't look like colleagues. They looked like a couple. And as I watched, he leaned in closer, whispering something in her ear that made her smile in a way she hadn't smiled with me in months. I sat there, frozen, as I watched them. They moved through the meal like they'd done this 100 times before. I felt like an outsider looking in on something I was never supposed to see. I wanted to burst through the doors, to confront her, to scream at both of them. But I stayed in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answered. Eventually, they left together, walking side by side out of the restaurant and down the street, lost in conversation, oblivious to the world around them. I couldn't bring myself to follow them. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the spot where they'd disappeared, wondering how everything had come to this. It was almost midnight when I finally drove home, numb and unsure of what to do next. When Laura came home later, she slipped into bed beside me without a word. I lay there, wide awake, feeling the bed sink as she settled in next to me. She smelled faintly of wine and that same cologne I'd caught before. I couldn't move, Couldn't even look at her. All I could do was lie there, thinking about everything I'd just witnessed. The next morning, I decided it was time to talk to her. No more waiting, no more second guessing. Whatever was going on between us, I had to face it head on. The morning felt different, thick with tension. Laura was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, casually sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone as if everything was normal. I stood there for a second, watching her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the person I saw last night. My chest tightened. A mix of anger, hurt, and confusion swirling together. "Laura," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, surprised by my tone. "Yeah?" "We need to talk." I could feel my throat tighten, my pulse racing. I had no idea where to start or how much to say. I only knew I couldn't hold this in any longer. Her expression shifted, a flicker of something. Was it guilt? She set her coffee down and nodded, pulling out a chair across from me at the kitchen table. "What's going on with us?" I asked. I could barely look at her, focusing instead on the small crack in the table, tracing its edge with my finger. "Lately, you've been different, distant, and I can't ignore it anymore." She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with her phone, her usual calm demeanor slipping. "It's just work stress, Jake. Things have been crazy, and I've been putting in more hours than usual. I didn't mean to make you feel like I was distant." Her voice was low, guarded, but she wouldn't look me in the eye. "Work, huh?" I let out a humorless laugh, my voice colder than I'd intended. "So that's what last night was? Work?" She froze, her face losing color. "What do you mean?" Her words were slow, cautious. "I went by the restaurant, Laura. I saw you with him." I swallowed, forcing down the bitterness rising in my throat. "The way you looked at him, that wasn't just work." I could feel my anger spilling over, no longer contained. She sat there, stunned, her face a mix of shock and shame. "Jake, it's not what you think." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh, really? So explain it to me." My words were sharp, and I could see them hit her like a slap. For a long moment she was silent, staring down at her hands. Finally she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "His name is Jason. He's someone I met at work. We've been spending a lot of time together, and yes, we got close. Closer than we should have." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. "But it wasn't supposed to be anything serious, Jake. I was just, I don't know, lonely." "Lonely?" I repeated, the word stinging. "So you find someone else? Someone who just happens to make you feel a little more alive?" She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "Jake, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was just a stupid mistake, one I regret." I pulled my hand back, feeling the anger surge through me. "A mistake? Laura, this wasn't some one-time thing. This is months of lying, sneaking around behind my back. You made choices every day to hide this from me. That's not a mistake. That's betrayal." Her face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I should have told you when I started feeling whatever I was feeling, but I didn't know how, and by the time I realized it was wrong, it was too late." I wanted to believe her. Part of me did, but the betrayal was too raw, too deep. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice cold and detached. She hesitated. "A few months, since the fall." My heart sank, remembering all those months of late nights, her changed demeanor, the times I'd tried to reach out to her only to be met with silence. "So what now, Laura?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where does this leave us?" She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. "I don't know, Jake. I don't know if we can fix this, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you. I never wanted that." But I didn't respond, because deep down I wasn't sure if I could try. Days passed in a blur. Every time I looked at Laura, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. She was there, moving around the house, going through the motions of our life together, but everything felt off-kilter, broken. We tried to keep things civil, not for the sake of any kids, since we didn't have any, but just to avoid the screaming matches I felt bubbling up inside me whenever we were alone. I couldn't trust myself to stay calm. The anger was too raw. But one night, after another long, tense silence over dinner, I found myself staring at her, wondering how we'd ended up here. She looked worn out, guilty, barely touching her food. I could tell she'd been struggling, but a part of me couldn't sympathize. She'd done this. She'd let Jason into her life, knowing what it would do to us, and she'd still chosen him. "I need answers, Laura," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was firm, controlled. "You say you want to make this work, but I can't move forward until I understand. Until I know why this happened." She put down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. "I know, and you deserve that." She looked up, a sadness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I guess I felt like something was missing, Jake. We'd fallen into a routine, and somewhere along the way I lost myself. When I met Jason, it felt like a spark, something I hadn't felt in years." I felt the sting of her words, the implication that whatever she was missing, she hadn't found it with me. "So what? You needed someone else to feel alive? To feel valued?" Her eyes filled with tears. "It sounds terrible, I know. And maybe it was selfish, but I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I just wanted to feel something different. Something exciting." I swallowed hard, the bitterness thick in my throat. "Do you love him?" She hesitated, and the pause was like a knife twisting in my gut. "No," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't love him, Jake. I never loved him. It was just an escape." "An escape," I repeated, trying to wrap my mind around it. "So while I was here waiting up for you, trusting you, you were off with him, escaping?" I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Do you even realize what that feels like?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I can only imagine, Jake, and I'll never be able to make it right, I know that. But if you can just give me a chance, I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words and let them heal the wounds she'd left. But I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind, the one that kept whispering, "How can you trust her again?" But I realized that I needed more than just words to decide. "If you want this to work, Laura, you're going to have to cut him off completely. No contact, none." She nodded immediately, relief flooding her face. "Done. I'll delete his number, block him on everything." "You have my word, Jake. I want to rebuild what we had, more than anything." A part of me softened, seeing her willingness to try, to make amends. But I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and I wasn't sure if love alone would be enough to carry us through the damage. The following weeks were an emotional minefield. Laura cut all ties with Jason. I made sure of that, even went through her phone to confirm he was blocked on every platform. She accepted it without argument, doing everything she could to prove she was committed to repairing what was left of our marriage. She'd leave little notes around the house, words of apology, and promises to rebuild my trust. She was affectionate, attentive, even suggesting we go to counseling together. But no matter what she did, I felt hollow. The trust that had once bound us together was gone, and I couldn't shake the constant questions. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she was late from work, even by a few minutes, my mind spiraled into suspicion. It felt like I was a stranger in my own home, watching every move she made, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman I'd once known. One evening, I came home late after grabbing a drink with a few friends. I opened the door to find Laura sitting on the living room couch, staring down at her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger. She looked up when she heard me come in, her eyes tired, the sadness etched deep into her face. "Jake," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." I dropped my keys on the counter, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in the room. "What are you saying, Laura?" She sighed, her eyes brimming with tears. I thought if I tried hard enough, if I showed you how sorry I was, maybe you'd forgive me. Maybe we'd find a way back to what we had, but it feels like I'm only hurting you more by staying. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. You're holding on to so much pain, and I'm the one who put it there." I sat down across from her, exhausted, my heart heavy with the truth we both knew but hadn't said aloud. "You're right," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I don't know how to let it go. No matter how hard I try, I can't forget what you did. I can't stop seeing you with him every time I close my eyes." A tear rolled down her cheek and she quickly wiped it away, nodding. "I understand, Jake. I hate myself for what I did to us, for taking us down this path. But if letting go is the only way for you to heal, maybe it's what we have to do." We sat in silence, the reality settling between us. It felt surreal, like this wasn't how our story was supposed to end. And yet, it was the only ending that made sense. The next morning, we started discussing the logistics. Who would stay in the house, what we'd do with our shared finances, how we'd handle breaking the news to family and friends. We were calm, almost businesslike about it, and yet I could feel the sadness clinging to every word. It was like saying goodbye to a life we'd spent over a decade building together, one memory at a time. A week later, Laura packed her things and moved out. Watching her go was one of the hardest moments of my life. She paused at the door, her hand lingering on the handle, as if she might turn back, as if she wanted one last chance to say something that could change it all. But instead, she just looked at me, her eyes full of the regret that couldn't change a thing. "I'll always love you, Jake. I just wish I'd never hurt you the way I did." With that, she was gone. The house was unbearably quiet after she left, the silence thick and unyielding. I wandered from the room to room, trying to make sense of a home that no longer felt like mine. Her absence was everywhere, and it hurt, but there was also a strange sense of relief, of knowing that the healing could finally begin. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. I threw myself into work, reconnected with friends, and started finding pieces of myself that had been buried under years of routine and complacency. Over time, the pain dulled, the memories faded, and I began to feel like myself again, or at least some new version of myself who had survived this storm. Years later, I ran into Laura at a mutual friend's wedding. She was there with a date. Someone who looked kind. Someone who made her laugh in that carefree way she'd once laughed with me. We exchanged polite smiles, shared a few words, and then went our separate ways. It was in that moment that I realized I'd finally let go. The anger, the resentment, they were just memories now. Remnants of a life that had shaped me, but no longer defined me. I knew I'd be okay. I'd learned to trust again, to love again, even if it meant taking things one day at a time. And as I watched her from across the room, I silently wished her well, knowing that maybe, just maybe, we'd both found the peace we'd been searching for all along.
I always thought of my wife, Emily, as the epitome of faithfulness. Simple, grounded, the kind of woman who didn't care about the drama or attention most people seem to crave. We had been together for 8 years, married for 5. Emily was the type of person who avoided the spotlight, content with quiet weekends at home, watching old movies, cooking, or reading. She wasn't into wild parties, didn't care about flirting with random people, and never gave me a reason to doubt her loyalty. Our relationship wasn't perfect, of course, whose is, but it was solid, or so I thought. Then came the wedding. It was our mutual friends, Sarah and Tom, tying the knot. They'd been together for years, and their wedding was going to be a big reunion for our college group. Emily was excited, maybe a little too excited, but I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just happy to catch up with old friends she hadn't seen in a while. I didn't realize that wedding would become the turning point in my marriage, the moment when everything I thought I knew about Emily would shatter. We arrived at the wedding in high spirits, holding hands as we walked into the picturesque vineyard where the ceremony would take place. Emily looked stunning in her simple yet elegant dress, her usual modesty wrapped up in understated beauty. I couldn't have been prouder to have her by my side. As the evening wore on, I started to notice something. Emily, my quiet, unassuming wife, was suddenly the life of the party. She was laughing louder than usual, her smile wider, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in years. At first, I told myself it was the champagne, the good vibes of the event. But when she started spending an unusual amount of time with one of the groomsmen, Jake, an old friend of Tom's, I felt the first twinges of unease. They chatted at the bar, standing close, their conversation punctuated with laughter. I told myself they were just catching up. After all, we all knew Jake from college. But something about the way Emily leaned in when she spoke to him, the way her hand lingered on his arm, it set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to shake it off, not wanting to be that paranoid husband who ruins his wife's fun. But as the night progressed, I started to notice more. Emily seemed to be seeking Jake out, finding reasons to be near him. At one point, I lost track of her during the reception, and when I finally spotted her, she was out on the terrace with him, their faces lit by the soft glow of string lights. They were standing just a little too close, talking in hushed voices, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to keep calm as I watched Emily with Jake from across the terrace. It was ridiculous, I told myself. This was Emily, the same woman who barely flirted with me when we first started dating, the same person who couldn't stand being the center of attention. She was just catching up with an old friend, that's all. But then they laughed, and Jake leaned in closer, his hand resting casually on her lower back. That knot in my stomach tightened into something sharper, something that felt a lot like jealousy. I wasn't usually the jealous type, but this was different. This wasn't just harmless conversation anymore. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was the alcohol playing tricks on my mind. I had to get some air and shake off the thoughts swirling in my head. I stepped outside and found myself on a quiet part of the terrace, away from the laughter and music. The cool night air hit me like a wave, giving me a moment to think clearly. I needed to trust her, right? Emily wasn't like that. She wasn't someone who would do something as reckless as flirt with a guy at a wedding, in front of all our friends, no less. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. When I walked back inside, I tried to keep my distance, watching Emily as she made her rounds. She danced with the bride, toasted with the groom, and seemed to be having the time of her life. But I couldn't ignore the moments when she gravitated toward Jake. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I knew her too well to brush it off. Then it happened. Right as the night was winding down and people were starting to leave, I noticed Emily slip away again. I didn't want to overreact, so I let her go, assuming she was heading to the bathroom or grabbing one last drink. But when she didn't come back after 10 minutes, I decided to look for her. I weaved through the dwindling crowd, trying not to seem panicked, but my heart was racing. I checked the bar first, empty, the dance floor, nothing. I stepped outside, scanning the terrace and garden area, but still no sign of her. And then I saw it, the faint glow of a phone screen coming from a secluded spot behind the trees. I moved closer, my breath shallow, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but what I saw hit me like a punch to the gut. There was Emily, pressed up against the side of the building, Jake's body pressed close to hers. They were in a shadowed corner, but it was clear as day to me. His hand was on her waist, fingers digging into the fabric of her dress, and her lips were on his. I froze. My brain couldn't fully process what I was seeing. This wasn't just some innocent flirtation. Emily, my faithful wife, was kissing another man in the dark at our friend's wedding. It felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart hammering in my chest. Emily, the woman I thought I knew inside and out, was kissing Jake, her hands wrapped around his neck, their bodies pressed together like they'd done this before. I wanted to scream, to tear them apart, but all I could do was watch, completely paralyzed by shock. After what felt like an eternity, they finally pulled apart. Emily's lips were slightly swollen, her eyes wide and filled with something I didn't recognize. Excitement? Guilt? Lust? Jake whispered something in her ear, something that made her smile, and it took everything in me not to storm over there and demand answers. But instead, I just turned around, my mind racing, my stomach in knots. I needed a moment to breathe, to think. What the hell had just happened? I stumbled back into the reception hall, my legs feeling weak and shaky. The lights, the music, the people laughing and dancing, it all felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from a distance. I knew I had to confront her, but I wasn't ready, not yet. I needed to figure out how this could have happened, how she could have done this to me. So I waited. I grabbed a drink, something stronger than I normally would, and tried to steady my thoughts. Maybe it was just a stupid one-time thing. Maybe the alcohol, the wedding atmosphere, it had gotten to her. People make mistakes, right? But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The way they had kissed, the way she had looked at him, it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment lapse in judgment. This had been building for a while. Emily eventually reappeared, looking completely normal, as if she hadn't just been wrapped up in another man's arms. She came over to me smiling, her cheeks flushed, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a bad dream. But the minute she leaned in to kiss my cheek, I pulled back slightly, unable to mask the hurt and suspicion bubbling inside me. She noticed, of course. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I could feel her eyes searching mine, trying to gauge what I knew. "I saw you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "with Jake." For a second, Emily froze, her smile faltering, her face going pale. But then, to my surprise, she quickly regained her composure. "It wasn't what you think," she said, her voice suddenly calm, almost rehearsed. "He was just saying goodbye, and we got a little too close. It didn't mean anything." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But I couldn't shake the image of her lips on his, the way her body had responded to him. "That wasn't just a goodbye, Emily. Don't lie to me." Her eyes darted away for a moment, and I saw the guilt flicker across her face before she masked it again. "It was a mistake," she finally admitted. "It was stupid, and I'm sorry. But it's not what you think. I'd never actually cheat on you. You have to believe me." But the words rang hollow. I could see there was more, much more, that she wasn't saying. Emily's apology hung in the air like a bad joke, the kind where no one's laughing. She stood there, trying to convince me that what I saw wasn't what it clearly was. But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Something deep inside me had snapped. The trust I had in her, the faith that she was the one person in the world who would never betray me, was unraveling faster than I could keep up with. "You kissed him, Emily. How do you expect me to believe that was just a mistake?" My voice was low, controlled, but my hands were trembling. She took a step closer, reaching for my arm, but I pulled away. "Jake and we've just been talking," she stammered. "It got out of hand tonight, I swear. I'll end it, whatever it is, right now." I wanted to believe her, but that nagging feeling wouldn't let go. Talking? That's what she called this? Her lips on another man, her body practically melting into his. Talking didn't lead to the kind of heat I saw between them. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold. "How long has this been going on?" She looked away, biting her lip, the truth hovering just behind her eyes. "It's nothing serious," she said softly, but I could see the cracks forming. She was starting to crumble under the weight of the lies she had been holding back. We just started texting a few weeks ago. I never meant for it to go this far, I promise." I felt a wave of anger rise up inside me. Texting. So this wasn't just a one-night mistake. It had been brewing, building up behind my back. "Show me," I said, my voice flat. "Show me the messages." Emily's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "Jake deleted them," she lied, too quickly, her voice shaky. "He didn't want to cause any trouble. It was stupid. We just got too close, that's all." But I knew better. If she wasn't willing to show me, that meant there was more to this than she was admitting. Much more. "Emily, you need to stop lying." "Right now," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "If you don't come clean, I swear this will only get worse." For a long, tense moment, she was silent, staring at the ground, like she was trying to find an escape route. But then, finally, she let out a shaky breath, and the facade dropped. "It's been a couple of months," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "We started talking after we saw him at Sarah's bachelorette party. He messaged me on Instagram, and we just clicked. At first, it was harmless, just talking about music, life, whatever. But then, things changed. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut." "A couple of months?" My voice was incredulous, barely holding back the anger boiling inside me. "So, you've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face all this time?" She didn't say anything. Her silence was the answer I didn't want, but expected. I couldn't believe it. The simple, faithful woman I thought I had married had been living a double life, carrying on some secret relationship while pretending everything was fine between us. How had I missed the signs? How had she become this person? "I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." The worst part? I could see in her eyes that she did feel sorry. Sorry she had been caught. Sorry she couldn't keep up the charade any longer. But the thing that truly hit me, the thing that left me standing there in stunned disbelief, was that this wasn't the first time. It couldn't have been. No one suddenly flips a switch and starts sneaking around after years of loyalty. This had been in her all along, hiding beneath the surface. Emily stood in front of me, her face pale, eyes full of regret, but I couldn't feel any sympathy. Not anymore. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had loved and trusted for years, had been living a lie. And now, all the lies were tumbling out like an avalanche, crushing what little was left of the foundation we had built. I never wanted it to get this far, she kept saying, her voice trembling. It was just excitement, something new. But it didn't mean anything. But the words rang hollow. It didn't matter what she said. I knew the truth now. She had let herself slip into something darker, something that had always been lurking just beneath her simple, faithful exterior. She wasn't the innocent, devoted wife I had believed her to be. She was someone else entirely, a stranger. I need to know everything, I said, my voice barely holding back the rage boiling inside me. No more lies, Emily. If you want any chance of fixing this, you need to tell me the truth. All of it. She hesitated, her hands shaking as she wiped away a tear. It didn't start as anything serious, she began, her voice soft, almost fragile. Jake was just fun to talk to. He was different. We'd text, and at first, it was innocent. But then, things started to get more flirty. He'd make these comments, and I didn't stop him. I don't know why. It just made me feel... She paused, struggling to find the words. Alive. Alive? That word felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Had she been bored with me? With our life together? I didn't think it was cheating, she continued, her words rushing out now. Not at first. It was just flirting, just harmless fun. But after a few weeks, it got physical. The room seemed to close in around me. Physical? I asked, my voice shaking. What does that mean, Emily? Her eyes dropped to the floor. We met up a few times, she whispered, just to talk at first. But then we kissed, and a few weeks ago, we slept together. I felt the world tilt beneath me like the ground had fallen out from under my feet. Slept together. My wife had not only been sneaking around behind my back, but she had crossed the line I'd been terrified of all night. And now, here she was, confessing it like it was some unfortunate mistake. How many times? I demanded, my voice cold, barely containing the fury. How many times did you sleep with him? She flinched at my tone, but finally she answered, 3. It happened 3 times, but I swear it didn't mean anything. I didn't want it to go that far. I couldn't breathe. The betrayal, the lies, it was all too much. Emily, my wife, had slept with another man not once, but multiple times. And she had the audacity to stand here, saying it didn't mean anything, like that somehow made it better. I don't care if it meant nothing, I spat, my voice shaking with barely controlled anger. You cheated, Emily. You betrayed me, and now you're standing here, trying to justify it? She broke down, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching at mine in desperation. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you, I swear. I was just lost, But I yanked my hands away, stepping back from her. You weren't lost, I said, my voice low but firm. You knew exactly what you were doing. You made the choice over and over again to lie to me. You made a fool of me. She sobbed harder, collapsing into a chair, her face buried in her hands. But I couldn't feel anything for her anymore. The woman I thought I loved, the woman I thought I had built a life with, was gone. All that was left was this stranger who had shattered everything we had. Is it over? I asked after a long moment of silence, my voice cold. With Jake, is it over? She nodded through her tears. Yes. I told him tonight. It's over, I swear. But I didn't believe her. How could I? She had lied to me for months, deceiving me at every turn. Even now, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't telling me. I can't do this, I finally said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. I can't stay married to someone I don't trust. I don't know who you are anymore, Emily. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with panic. Please don't say that. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, But I shook my head, cutting her off. There's nothing to fix. You destroyed it. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the life I thought I had. The woman I thought I knew. The night air was cold as I stepped outside, but for the first time in hours, I felt like I could finally breathe again. There would be no going back.